Logic. Logic. Logic magician.
Hey everyone, we're the Logic Magicians. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm out of tune. No, I'm Zach. Good to see you all.
Yep, good to see everyone. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and jump right in. Today's video is gonna be a continuation of our series on logical fallacies. We have a video where we give a kind of broad overview of the categories and the subcategories of fallacies. Fallacies being just kind of cliche bad arguments that people kind of accept and happen often enough that we have a name for them. And then we also have a video where we go over fallacies of relevance, which covers bad arguments where the person is bringing up something that is irrelevant to that core of logic that we kind of talk about.
What are we going to talk about today, though?
Today, we're going to be talking about the broad category of fallacies of presumption. Kind of as the name implies, presumption. Yep. Kind of as the name implies, these fallacies are basically based on some type of assumption that the speaker is making. So this could be some type of bias. It could be some type of, assuming that like a certain way of thinking is best, assuming, a variety of different things. So we're going to kind of go through this, and there's actually two subcategories, and they're not true subcategories. It's more that there's one subcategory that's unique enough to talk about on its own, and then there's another one that is really kind of just more the general fallacy of presumption. So first we're going to talk about what are called fallacies of presupposition, and this is still, there's no extra special definition for it. It's still just the speaker is bringing some type of assumption to the argument. And then after that, we're going to be dealing with the subcategory fallacies of induction. And those specifically have to do with some type of data manipulation. So some type of misuse of data.
I'm sure that we'll get there, but is that purposeful data misuse, or is that accidental data misuse, or does it matter?
So it's bad logic either way, if it's intentional or accidental. But and we'll also kind of talk about malicious versus non-malicious, because there's several of these things where I commit these fallacies fairly regularly, and they can still serve a bit of a purpose. And so we'll also talk somewhat about malicious versus non-malicious, because there are times where I use these fallacies for specific purposes, or accidentally.
Malicious purposes.
No, not malicious. Like I do sometimes use them intentionally, but there's a difference between, like, I'd say malicious and non-malicious. For example, we'll be talking about fake precision at one point, and fake precision is basically, one version of it is you just make up statistics. So if I'm talking to my class and I'm like, 95% of you didn't do the homework, I haven't necessarily done the math on that. I don't know if it's exactly 95%, but the point I'm trying to get across is that a large portion of you did not do the homework. And there's things like that where it's not necessarily malicious, or like saying, I'm 85% sure. Like, you can't put a percentage number on how sure you are about something.
Right.
So I feel like that's not malicious, right? You're not trying to mislead someone using bad data with that. So we'll kind of dive into that a little bit more further on in the video. So the first kind of general fallacy of presupposition that we're going to be talking about is a fallacy called begging the question. Begging the question. And this is one that I know sometimes trips up some of my students because the word question is in it. And this does not actually inherently necessarily involve a question. It's also sometimes called circular reasoning. And this is basically, so a begging the question fallacy happens when a person is assuming their conclusion in one of their premises, in one of their kind of supporting statements, right? So my kind of go-to example for this is bee stings hurt because they're painful, right? That's really, that's not really actually providing an argument.
And
you're assuming that they're painful, and you're using that as evidence for the fact that they're painful, and you're kind of hiding that by using a synonym.
So that's kind of like when there's this classic psychology study where if you give a reason for something, people are a lot more likely to let you get away with it, even if the reason has nothing to do with it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Another example, kind of classical example that people will often bring up is the soul is immortal because it lives forever. Right?
That's just defining immortal.
Exactly. That's not really providing an argument for why you would think or act as if the soul is like that. There's just no argument being given there. So this is definitely something to be on the lookout for, because people will make it seem like they actually have supporting evidence for something when it's really they're just kind of using their conclusion as a supporting statement. So.
And that's never okay to do, or is that sometimes okay to do?
I mean, again, logically, it's never okay. This is definitely one where it can be abused, like you said, psychologically. If you give a reason for something, people are more likely to kind of accept it. This kind of bypasses certain, critical thinking mechanisms of the brain, things like that. So, yeah, I would recommend not using it. And this is actually, so this is one that comes up in religion fairly regularly. Which is, so
I've seen that.
Another classic example is, well, it's in the religious text, so we should believe it. Well, why should we believe the religious text? Well, because the deity says to believe
because the religious text says so.
Yeah, and so why should we believe that the deity says that the religious text should be followed? Well, because the religious text says to believe the deity. And what you have there is a circle. It's a kind of self-reinforcing circle. So logically, you're not actually providing an argument. You're kind of assuming your conclusion as part of your evidence. And sometimes it's more subtle than other times. So it's definitely something to take into consideration.
Cool.
Now, a way to avoid this is actually provide a supporting argument. Right? Don't try and dodge out of.
Wait a second. To do that, that means I have to actually think through what I'm saying, though, right?
Yeah.
And what if I don't want to do that?
Well, then, kind of pointing back to our episode 3 video of critical thinking and all that. If you don't want to think critically, I mean, there's not a whole lot I can do about that.
Well, good, because that sounds tedious.
It is. It's tedious and it takes effort. Yeah. So the next one that we're going to cover is actually one that appears fairly often, and it's a good one to be aware of. And that is the false dilemma, also sometimes known as the black and white fallacy, or the false choice fallacy. And this is a fallacy in which you present a person with limited options when more options actually exist. Now, I say limited options. Usually, when we're talking about a false dilemma, it's usually binary. It's like either A or B, or like choice A or choice B, and that's all that you have. But there's actually, I like to expand the definition a little bit broader and just say providing limited options when more options exist, because there are times where it's not necessarily a binary. So, for example, and this can actually sometimes even crop up in a question. If I said, Zach, what's your favorite color, yellow or blue?
Orange.
Right? That's a
orange for for the record, if anybody out there is listening and they think to themselves, oh, I want to send Zach his favorite color on a piece of paper, it's not actually orange. That was just as an example. So please keep your orange letters to yourself. I was begging the question, assuming that people actually want to send things.
There you go. That's true. Well,
no,
not quite begging the question, but you were making an assumption there that people would want to send things.
That false choice, false dilemma is used a whole lot in magic. They call it the magician's choice, where you give somebody 3 options and you say something like, do this, and then they do it, and then regardless of what they do, they're doing what the magician wants them to do. So
there's also, I know there's several tricks where you like let the person make a choice, but it's actually a false choice because you kind of just tailor it to kind of how you're wanting the trick to proceed anyways.
I learned a really fun one last night actually about that, so
awesome.
Yeah. That's all. That's all.
Okay.
I mean, I could do it right now. It's more fun if you if you're in person, because it involves handing the deck to you and you shuffle it, and it feels really, really, really fair because you get. I shuffle the cards. You tell me when to stop. I give you half the deck from where you shuffled from. You shuffle the deck. I give you my half. You shuffle it together, and then I still find your card. It's magic. It's mind blowing. But on a computer screen, it doesn't work. It's like, there you go. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Anyway, what were you saying?
False dilemmas. And another one, like another option or other kind of versions that often pop up is, and the kind of classical version I like to use is, after high school, you can either go to college or you can get a job. Right? Those are not a person's only options. Like you can take a gap year, you can go travel, you can literally not do anything. Like, there's all kinds of additional options. So the problem with false dilemmas is it is inherently biasing a question in a manner that makes it impossible for a person to answer very accurately, and it will often generate kind of inaccurate answers. And so it's important to be on the lookout. So, they're very easy to avoid. Either, provide more options, or actually best is just to leave it open-ended or provide all options, right? Now, there are times where I tell students that because of certain circumstances, a binary option or a limited choice option is not actually a false dilemma. It might be a real dilemma. It might be an actual choice that you have to make, but it's not a false dilemma because those are the limited choices. So, for example, as a teacher with some control in my classroom, let's say I'm giving a student a warning about cheating on a test. I can say, you either stop cheating or I'll give you an F on the test. Right? The student can't be like, well, there's this third option where I cheat and you don't, because I'm not actually letting them have that option. As the person who's in control of the outcome in that situation, I am actually limiting those choices. So it's not a false dilemma, it's an actual dilemma. So it's not necessarily anytime you're presented with a binary or limited choices, it's inherently a false dilemma, but it can often be a false dilemma. So just make sure you're kind of thinking about what options you're encountering or what options you're providing.
So I guess a way, if somebody's doing that to you, to avoid that would be just to pause before answering rather than accepting the choices given, right?
Sure, absolutely. Or even do what like you did kind of instinctively, which is just say neither. Orange is my favorite color. Right? Or be like,
it's not, for the record.
Yeah. and so you can also, especially if you're in like a more confrontational debate, where you are actually debating an issue and someone provides a false dilemma, just presents you with a false dilemma, you can actually call them out on it and say like, that's a simplistic view of the options. There are actually these other options available, and I choose, this other option, which not only is not letting your debate opponent kind of pigeonhole you, but it's also going to kind of undermine their credibility if it's in front of an audience or anything like that.
Right.
On the topic.
Would you, never mind, that's too in the nitty gritty. What I was going to say, I'm going to say it anyway. I'm going to get in the nitty gritty. It's a total character choice, but a simple question of, is that the only two options? And if they're being honest, then they'll have to express, well, no, there are other options. And that really can put them in the position of acknowledging that they're being unfair as well.
Yeah, so. Exactly. So that's a good one to be on the lookout for. Now this next one, and this one's a very interesting one. And I don't think it upsets people quite as much as the two quote fallacy, but this one can also, it really pushes against some of our kind of sentiments that were taught from a pretty early age. And it has to do with compromise. So this fallacy is called fallacy of moderation. And this is basically assuming that the middle ground between two extremes is correct or is the best option, right? It's kind of assuming that a compromise is good because it's a compromise. Now, it's not to say that compromises can't be good. Right? It's not to say that compromises in the middle path or the middle ground is bad, right? That's kind of an inverted fallacy of moderation, where you just assume that compromises are bad. No, but it's just saying that a compromise isn't good just because it's a compromise. It has to be good on its own merits, right? So, an example that we can use, we'll actually talk about healthcare. We'll kind of talk about two extremes. So currently, kind of the extreme here in the U.S., the extreme, and I use extreme as just like on the spectrum, either further left or further right. I was the opposite, further left or further right.
Further one way, yeah.
I'm not sure exactly how the video is recording it with it mirroring how it'll show up. So, yeah. But right now, like the last kind of healthcare that the conservative party, the Republicans, presented when they were trying to kind of do an overhaul of the current healthcare system in the U.S. was kind of a tax credit thing, where you would be able to put a portion of your taxes into a healthcare fund, essentially. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have either Obamacare or Medicare for all, or kind of more generally single payer healthcare. And so those are two very, on the spectrum, very opposing views. Now, if someone wants to take a compromise of that, a compromise could be that half the country is on a tax credit system and the other half of the country is on single payer healthcare. Right? Well, that doesn't actually make any sense. That would actually be an overall weaker system than if we adopted just one or the other. And and there's definitely times where a polar view is the correct.
A very cold view, you mean?
No, oh man, yep, a very cold view. But so a polarized view can be the correct one, right? It's the logically sound one. And also, especially within like political realms, political spectrums, that spectrum is constantly changing, right? Where that middle ground is going to be constantly changing. And so we really can't assume that a compromise is good just for the sake of compromise. So a way to avoid this is to
the example that I would have jumped to for that would be a serial killer who wants to kill 4 people, and then we have a compromise and we let them kill 2 people. And it's like everybody's better off because they only killed 2 people. But really, you just shouldn't kill people.
Yeah.
That's an
Yeah.
extreme view.
Exactly. And that's again another great example. Or, other impossibilities could ensue where, one person doesn't want there to be a speed limit, so they want the speed limit to be an infinite. And then another person wants the speed limit to be 10 miles per hour. So we'll have half of an infinite as, well, it'd be half
Right.
of an infinite minus 5. I don't know.
It's impossible.
Exactly. So again, or if you want to say, or if you go into a store and like the store has it listed as, and you want to buy, let's say, a TV, and the store has it listed as $500, and you go to the counter like, hey, I want to pay $100 for this, so let's meet in the middle, and you'll pay $30 or $300. Right? No, that's not how that necessarily works.
Cool.
Yeah.
So to avoid that, you could be more educated on what you're arguing about, and that way you know that if a TV costs to make $250, that's the baseline, like the bare minimum amount that you would be able to purchase it for, or something like that.
Yeah. So, being better informed on a topic, also just simply providing an actual logical argument in favor of your particular stance.
I'm getting the sense, Johnny, that you seem to like logic.
I do. Which is
weird.
There's certainly an argument to be made that assuming that logic and rational critical thinking are a good thing, there's definitely some assumptions being made there, if we want to get meta. But
we'll save that for a later episode.
Well, for me, it's mostly just thinking and critical thinking methodologies that have a better rate of success and accuracy in predicting outcomes. And so if a type of thinking produces that, then I think that's going to be a more desirable form of thinking. But
I'll meet you in the middle, and I will.
Yep. And so there's, and we'll talk. And we keep saying in videos we'll talk about epistemology later, but there will definitely be some time to talk about how it's very difficult to function without assumptions. Everyone makes assumptions. It's more about developing, like I keep saying, a self-awareness about the assumptions, their effect on your critical thinking, things like that. Okay, so the next one is another really interesting one. It is called the is-ought fallacy. The is-ought fallacy. Now, Zach, this is something I usually do with my students, but you probably have a better vocabulary than my 7th grade students. I hope so. But I'm guessing you know what the word ought means.
Like should or...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the is-ought fallacy, ought is a more archaic version of the word should. We, in kind of common English, we now use the word should instead. And so the is-ought fallacy is actually an example of an is-ought fallacy, which I think is pretty great. So an is-ought fallacy is that because something is a certain way, it should stay that way. So because we have called it the is-ought fallacy for a long time, we should continue to call it the is-ought fallacy as opposed to the is-should fallacy, which actually would make more sense because that's actually the word we use more commonly. So the is-ought fallacy, also sometimes known as the fallacy of tradition, is basically, and you can also invert it. So it's saying that because something is or isn't a certain way, it should stay that way. So for example, we always get the canned cranberry sauce, cranberry jam, Jello for Thanksgiving. So we should keep doing that.
Even though nobody eats it.
Exactly. And this actually um, has some interesting implications for like laws and legislation,
Yeah.
and judge rulings, because technically, arguments of whether or not something is constitutional, arguments of whether or not something has legal precedent, that's all an is-ought fallacy,
Right.
right? That's saying this is how we've done something, this is how we've done something for hundreds of years, or this is how the law has said that we should do something, so we're going to keep following that, which doesn't actually make logical sense. Just doing something because that's how we've always done something, or just doing something because that's how we've done something since the inception of the country, that's not actually a good argument.
Right. There's a story that I heard once, either from my dad or not my dad, someone else's dad, probably, maybe someone's son or daughter, somebody, um, of so once upon a time there was a woman, and she had a young daughter, and the woman was cooking a roast, and she took the roast and she cut off one end of it and then turned it around and cut off the other end of it and then put it in the pan and set it in the oven. And the little girl said, "Mommy, how come you do that? You cut off the ends." And then she said, "That's a good question. My mom always did it that way. Let me call her." And so she called up her mom and said, "Mom, how come you do that way?" And then she said, "My grandma or my mom always did it that way." And so she called up her grandma and said, "Hey, Grandma, how come you always did it that way?" And she said, "My pot was too small. And now you're wasting a whole lot of meat because your granny's pot was too small."
Exactly, and that's an awesome example of is-ought fallacy, is because we've always, mutilated our turkey before we cooked it. We shall continue to mutilate our turkey before we cook it.
What do you
Exactly.
mean by mutilate?
Chopping parts off.
Oh. Must be a Hungarian thing. I keep my turkey whole.
Well, your story, you just.
Oh, I said a roast, not a turkey. Come on. I'm not a
Oh, sorry. I'm
barbarian.
thinking Thanksgiving, and you're right. Sorry, you don't mean the roast, not the turkey. Oh, we're very serious people here, folks.
Yes, we are. Pay
Yep.
attention. We've always been serious, so we'll continue to be that way.
Exactly. And this video series has always gone longer than we expected to, so it will continue to go longer than we expected to. Okay. So that's again pretty much it for the more generalized
on
fallacies of presumption.
On the is-ought though, how do you go about arguing that? So like, if something is built on precedent, but it's a bad precedent, how do you argue that?
So again, it's one of those things where sometimes it's just not practical. And again, I don't want people to necessarily take away from this that Jonathan thinks we should get rid of the Constitution or laws or anything like that. No, definitely
That's an
not
easy example, because that
exactly. It's just basically it's that we need to be constantly reevaluating whether the kind of underlying arguments for the laws that are setting the precedent, are they good or not? And again, I certainly think that our understanding of science, the world, people, and even critical thinking and logic has developed and will continue to develop. So it's important that we are continually being, again, that element of self-reflection. So continually being self-reflective about what precedent we set, but then also, even with the Constitution, I mean, we've amended it numerous times, and I think that demonstrates that we realize, hey, there are times where we realize we need to nuance something or set a new precedent or change something, and I think it's important to be open to that and not be necessarily caught in kind of this vicious cycle of, I don't want to say tradition because that sometimes has like really personal belief connotations to it.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, I'm literally just talking about doing something for the sake of having always done it.
Right.
So it's important to not just fall into that loop and to be self-reflective and think about your reasons and your motivation behind doing things, so that you
Now,
aren't being lazy.
can because it's always done that way, like, okay, maybe this isn't the right topic for it because this is just like a broad overview and we should talk about it later. I'll just throw the question now, and if it is, then you can say, we'll talk about that later and we'll move on. But is there a case where you could look back at the way it was done and find that that's actually a good reason for it? Like, we've
Sure,
always
I would.
washed our, yeah.
Well, and again, like so, like saying like we've always washed our hands before eating, so we should continue to do so. I'm assuming that's what you're going with.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, like that actually, there's a solid logical reason behind that one that we actually have come to appreciate a little bit more in this pandemic, which is cleanliness and getting rid of viruses and bacteria and like just muck that's on our hands before we start putting things in our mouth. So again, I think there's definitely a case for that where there is that underlying logic that backs it. Another one, and I really want to add this so people don't like feel worried or even like personally attacked. I think like family traditions are a good type of, or I guess I should say potentially good, because I guess it depends on the family tradition, but a good type of an is-ought fallacy, right? It reinforces your identity as a family. It brings back nostalgic memories from childhood. So like holiday traditions, or if you have like if you and your wife, if you have like a date night every week, right? That can turn into somewhat of an is-ought fallacy, but there's genuine value in doing something and to developing these traditions because of how it reinforces identity, or how it makes you feel, or how it reinforces relationships. And
Right.
there's also something to be said for consistency. Working out, right? You get much better results if you do it consistently for the same amount of time, for the same intensity, etc. Right? And yeah, sure, you can build up on it, but it's that habitual nature of it that kind of guarantees long-term results, right? So I'd say in those cases there is something to be said where I guess the repetition of a thing inherently carries the benefit with it. So an is-ought fallacy would be good.
Cool. Sorry to spend so much time on. I was just
No,
curious.
no, nothing to apologize for. It's a good question.
I'm so sorry.
Um, and because you were sorry, you should always be sorry.
Yes.